If you want to learn about psychological growth without getting lost in complicated language, you're in the right place. This is the Relational Psych Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Carly Claney, licensed psychologist and the founder and CEO of Relational Psych. On this show, we learn about the processes and theories behind personal growth. Please keep in mind that this podcast isn't a substitute for therapeutic advice, but we're here to point you in the right direction. Today, we have on the podcast Katie Maynard. Katie is a licensed psychotherapist in private practice in Seattle, Washington. Her lived experience informs and inspires her advocacy for better mental health care for people without children. Alongside her private practice, she also consults with providers seeking to enlarge their clinical competency and provide more affirmative services to child-free and childless clients. She's also currently working on a book that is based on a survey of 400 people without kids about their experiences in therapy. Katie, welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you. So today we're talking about all things childless, child-free, and I would just love to get right into the terminology because even as I say that, I think there's a lot of different places we could go with that.
Yeah. And that's really the number one thing that people want to know more about or stumble with in the beginning. Like, how do I choose a name for myself? What do these names really mean? Why are you saying child free? Why are you saying childless? And if you think about it, and I'm not the first person to say this, of course, there aren't many words for people without kids that are positive, or
Mm,
that are not describing a lack or a freedom from something else. So
right.
parenthood is seen, right, as the norm. And
Uh-huh.
so it is a terminology that feels especially cumbersome because of that, because we don't have a word.
Yeah, we're describing a negative. We're describing something without.
Right. We're not the standard. People without kids aren't the standard, even though we spend lots of our lives without children. We're born without, right? Like we are the standard until suddenly we're not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've listed a couple of them. What are the options?
So I think a lot of people want to see this binary of childless, child free, and that if you didn't want kids, you're child free. And if you did at any point, you're childless. And I think that works for a lot of people in a lot of situations. But when I asked, you had mentioned on the intro that survey that I did, when I asked people and I asked them to self describe, and I gave some suggestions, but I really wanted them to use the language, there were so many different responses and people used more than one term. So that was so interesting to me. And the word choice comes up a lot. So I'm child free by choice. I'm child free not by choice. I'm childless not by choice. I'm childless by choice can happen. People can also say things like, I'm child free after infertility, which I think would totally confound what I just said about that
Yes.
binary, right?
Uh-huh.
Because it is, you very much wanted children to the extent that you were trying and couldn't. And you medicalized the experience in a way, perhaps trying to fix it. And then you decided, actually, we're not going to do this. This is too hard. We reach a stoppage point, and now we feel relief and pleasure in our life and contentment, and that feels more child free. So yeah, a lot of things come up for people. It's so individual.
Yeah, and I can really hear already that you articulate the meaning behind the words, whether it's a choice, whether it has to do with desire or not, whether it has to
Mm.
do with, again, this is just choice, but if it was chosen or done to you in a way. And I think
Yeah.
all of that then has to do with how you're holding it in the moment. Is there an integration about what that means for your experience? Is there any grief? Is there resistance to what the label might bring up?
Oh, for sure. And I think I've just recently come across, and it was a dissertation by a researcher in Australia named Heather McKay. And she has a description of this choice in a way that I think really resonates in a way I haven't seen it. And she talks about active choice, constrained choice, and denied choice. And
Mm,
active choice to me means somebody who says, I never wanted to be a parent. There could be nothing in my life that would change for me to want to actually be in parent role, have a child. I don't want to do that. That feels very active. Constrained feels more like, I don't know that we can financially afford this. I have past trauma that I'm working through, and I'm not in a place where I can parent right now, but I would like to if I would have
mm,
children if that kind of feels
yeah.
like this constrained choice. And then the denied choice is I have tried to have children, I've tried to adopt, I've tried to have them biologically, any of that, and it hasn't worked. I've been denied that choice. Or I fell in love with a partner and they don't want children. And so you could argue whether that's constrained or denied, but people would kind of say, I've aged out of the process. I wish I could have had children. They were denied that option to try.
Mhm. It's so helpful to have that distinction because I think we'll hopefully get into this more, but I think for a lot of people, there's so many mixed feelings of what this conversation brings up for them,
Hmm.
whether there's guilt or judgment or the sense of selfishness and all of those kinds of things. So I think being able to distinguish where your life circumstances and also your what you're bringing into it, where you might load there, I think it just neutralizes the experience.
Right. Because of course we bring in all the other intersecting parts of ourselves into it.
Yeah.
And we're not in just one box ever for any situation that we experience. And having children, deciding, not being able to decide about children
Mhm.
is one of those.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Which I think is shown with that survey that you talked about,
Yeah.
where people they melded things together. They brought in other adjectives or other descriptors in order to say, I don't just fit in one box. I really have to check a
Mhm.
couple things here.
Yeah. And the thing that really does stand out to me is most people will say, well, I don't say childless. I just say I'm a person without kids or I don't have kids. So it's almost like a label that's given to us. And the research, if you look at like Library of Congress subheadings, the term is childless, right? And so
Oh.
that is how research lumps everybody without kids there. Um, and it doesn't resonate for people. They don't say, hi, I'm childless. Like I will say the other thing it does is it can collect community. So I think a lot of
Mhm.
child free people and a lot of childless people like that term in a sense because you can find somebody on Instagram or you can find a support group or you can find an
Mm.
activity group that's labeled as, oh, we're a child free group of adults. And oh, these are my people. Feels good.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think too, is there this might be in the research or something, but is there an age where that starts to become the norm? Because I'm thinking if you're in your 20s, especially if you're not even married, that's likely not something that you're going to start to
Yeah.
either look for or articulate about yourself. But it's interesting that even from a government perspective,
Okay.
there's already this forced category for all people.
Right. And I think several thoughts as you're saying that a lot of us are considered pre parents, intentional parents, right? Like we're just kind of considered that one day this person will have kids probably. And there's so much bias about people changing their mind. Where if somebody is in that active choice, I think the research shows in your early 20s, if you're in that active choice of, I don't want to be a parent, nothing could change at all, that you'll likely do that. You will likely
Mm.
have a child free life. And so you will be perceived by society, by therapists, by providers, by your school you go to, everything as, well, you'll either change your mind or, oh, you'll be such a great parent one day, don't give up. Or maybe not so patronizing, or just say, oh, this person I don't know very well, they'll probably be a parent when they get into their 40s. They'll have kids by
Mhm.
then.
Just the assumption.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Just the assumption. And that if you think about it, many of our clients that we work with are pre midlife. And so there's this time when you are perhaps assuming it will happen one day, which I feel like is the largest chunk of people that I see in my practice. And that was my story personally, that this will probably happen one day. I want it to happen. We'll see. And that I think is where we definitely miss out in therapy of kind of discussing, yes, there are many life paths and we will see what happens. And let's also maybe create some discussion and inquiry around what if that doesn't happen and you actually don't have children? What could life be like? How could that feel meaningful to you? What would you like to do with your life more intentionally that way?
That's so interesting that with something like having children, that's not common to have those different paths explored when someone is in a state of curiosity or uncertainty. Like you're saying, like I don't really think of therapists then saying, well, what if you didn't have kids right at the beginning when they're in that process of exploring it? As you
Mhm.
say, it's so common to just think, well, let's explore that later. Or the assumption will be that will just be the path that you'll take at some point when you're ready.
Yes. Yeah. And that, I mean, the thread there is the term pronatalism, which is just this assumption that most people want to and will have children and that it is the most valued life path. And you should do this. The should is really heavy there with some things. And I think that's imbued into our training as mental health providers. It's imbued into society. If you look at all the movies and shows and books, there's typically a miracle baby that happens, or somebody changes their mind and actually does have kids and they're so happy. Like it's
Mhm.
so present that of course inquiring into this alternate life path doesn't come up to us naturally. It's something that I think we have to remember to do sometimes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of that for the person who really doesn't wanna have children and the judgment against that, but I'm also thinking about the person who has kids and wish they didn't, and how much shame and conflict that would come up from that too. I know that's probably outside of the scope of this conversation, and yet I can see it being a part of the same continuum because of the did you
Mhm.
say pronatalism?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, which is a term I think people are like, doesn't that just mean having babies? Shouldn't everyone who wants a baby get to have one? And isn't that a nice term? And it's not quite that, right? I think that the intention of that term is more like almost a cultural obsession with this, that this is the right
Mm,
way to be a woman, especially. Or I think it's a very gendered experience often. And yeah, the hard part about knowing that you don't want kids is you face that anywhere you go. And you're never quite sure who's going to present that to you or throw it in an offhanded comment or say something that they don't know hits home for you because it's very
mhm.
common to say, "Oh, do you have kids? Oh, why not?" Or it's just yeah, it's such a norm.
Yeah, and then they don't know, like you're saying, they don't know what they're opening up when they say, "Oh, why not?" And it could be, "Oh my goodness, you just touched on all of my trauma, all of my grief,"
Mhm.
or so
Mhm.
much there.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned trauma and grief. And I do want to point out that I think a lot of people assume that an intentionally child free path is super easy. And on the other hand, people assume that a childless path where you did want kids is like constant trauma and grief, right? And the
Yeah,
reality is that there's aspects of both in both paths.
of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you
Yeah.
dig into that a little bit and talk about some of what that looks like?
Yeah. I think the idea of disenfranchised grief, of course, is like one of the most important things to think about because it is going to disenfranchise the child free from really experiencing people having empathy for them saying, "Hey, I don't want kids. And there are losses in my life, in my relationships and things. Oh, I kind of do kind of feel like I lose out on some things sometimes. Some people, right, may want to bring that up occasionally. And they're not seen as being enfranchised into grieving because it's not something that hasn't happened. It's not a life event like losing someone. And it's also not something that's like socially condoned to not want kids, right? So they're
Mhm.
disenfranchised there. And then the people that were kind of in this in middle place of I think I kind of want kids, like it's constrained, I think I won't have them. Nobody understands that because they're like, if you really wanted kids, you'd know. If make a decision one way or the other. Aren't you mature enough? Like that experience is so hard. And then the people who really wanted children are really grieving that, are having their grief denied by saying, well, if you had really wanted them, which, oh my gosh, that's so hard to hear. Or,
Mhm.
but why didn't you adopt? People throw that all the time.
Yeah.
Why didn't you do this? Oh, well, you didn't get married early enough. Or like it's always kind of looking towards the person. Um,
Mm.
as a responsible party for that. And I can't imagine going through grief feeling like I was responsible for the thing that I'm grieving, right?
Right. Yeah. Because already that's gonna be I think it's so common to feel guilt within grief,
Yeah.
whether I don't even think it should be there or not, that's not really the question, but to
Mhm.
have it then so explicitly identified as the personal responsibility is just seems really painful.
Right. And then the kind of the isolating experience that a lot of people talk about their grief after it's happened, after that they've kind of gone through, and maybe even just loss. We'll just say loss. Like it doesn't have to be the deep grief, just they've gone through a loss experience or any kind of trauma. They want to talk about it afterwards because there's no normalized way to bring that up in a conversation. Maybe it's harder to find community to talk about. And you don't want to plop into a provider's office. Oh, do you have kids? And then you start to cry. It's kind of like you keep that
Mhm.
inside and so you can say, no, it didn't work out. And then you go about and get your regular dental cleaning and it's okay. Right.
Ugh.
Right.
Mhm. Mhm.
There's so much that's kept inside.
Yeah, I'm thinking about with you mentioned therapists a couple times, and can you share more about I know there's not like typical norms all the time of what happens,
Mhm.
but how this can both come out in a harmful way or in a way that doesn't support the client and their experience? The conversation around, are you going to do it or have you tried or whatever?
Yeah, that's a great question because I think a lot of, if you look at like the self help stuff out there, a lot of the books about try to decide to have kids or should I have kids or what would it be like to not have kids are kind of just glorified lists of pros and cons. And they always end with, and parenthood is so hard, you should really be sure, but it's worth it. Like it kind of, that's the mood of the books. And there are a couple that are better than that. And so I think that if people have explored this maybe on their own and looked to that literature, they kind of don't even know that they can bring it up within therapy to really talk through. So I think that's like the number one thing is sometimes people don't know that it's even a clinical issue. I didn't know it was a clinical issue myself, right? Like we're not
Mhm.
trained to know that either. So I think people come to therapy and they are wanting to really get a lot of validation for how they're feeling because they're not seeing that other places. And I think
Right.
therapists need to know that is the number one thing to do is to see your client's story as individual, unique, and hear more about what they need validated.
Yeah, really be curious about, as you're saying, what their experience is, what they're needing, rather than just have this prescriptive way of thinking about the life path or even the path of processing or thinking through the issues.
Right. Yeah. And just like with any other big decision, there are pros and cons. I don't want to deny that. So that's the part of this, right? Kind of go through the imagine this, no, imagine that, thought experiments, right? That's still all very important. I think what's beautiful about therapy, if the therapist is open to it, is the person can really process the effects on all the relationships in their life because that's
Mm,
something that a lot of people hold and aren't able to talk through necessarily. Like my friends are saying this, I feel this way. I've always not wanted to have kids, but my mom is pressuring me again, and maybe I should do
mm.
it. What if she wants grandkids? Just so much of that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point too of how many people the experience affects. It is
Uh,
really not just an experience that would just be yours. It's you and maybe a partner, you and your friend group. It would change maybe the dynamics
mhm.
there. And then you're saying parents. How do you think about that of the ripples of impact?
Yeah, I kind of like to have people map out like their eco map. I don't know if you remember that from grad school. It's kind of like the map of your ecology of your life, where there's different systems, the places where you inhabit and spend time in, the relationships, structures, into institutions, things like that. And to really think about, okay, where can you show up and be your real self? Where are you free to express your interest in pursuing kids or not pursuing kids? Maybe to talk about your ambivalence, which I think it's a really bad rap of being called like indecision that you don't really care when in fact it's like you care very much about both options. Yeah.
Yeah, and it reminds me of what you said earlier about certainty. It seems like
Mm,
there's such this pressure on you have to be certain. You should really land on one end or the other with certainty.
mhm,
And you indicating ambivalence there. I think there is that trickiness of how do we land
mhm.
and what percentage are we landing if it is a choice at that point.
Right. And I think what can happen in therapy, at least the survey shows, and people have mentioned, and I experienced too, that therapists aren't necessarily comfortable with ambivalence about parenthood, that a lot of our own
Mm,
stuff can come up. There can be like this pressure of, oh my gosh, you're aging out of this process. We don't want you to miss out on this amazing experience. If the therapist is a parent, perhaps they're reflecting on their own needs and their own interest
yeah.
in other people being parents.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm. You've alluded to your own personal experience a few times in there, and I'm curious if there's anything in that you can share, both your experience in the process of it or anything that's relevant to that process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I would categorize myself as somewhat ambivalent for a lot of my life, that it would be okay if I have kids, it would be okay if I didn't.
Mhm.
And I didn't meet that many people that in my personal life or professional life that were able to go there with me. They really
Mm.
kind of wanted me, like I felt pressure, subtle or otherwise, to pick a side. Oh, but you're so good with kids, or oh, yeah, you'd get to travel, which is the number one things people say, which is kind of the stereotype, right? I don't travel that much now, so I don't know that. Yeah, and so that experience of like just sitting with the ambivalence was real interesting for me and finding care. There were therapists that didn't get it, and I found a couple that really did kind of get it, but there was like a limit to where they wanted to explore with me. They really kind of cut it off as, okay,
Mm.
we're good now, right? And they weren't interested in getting into the like deep dark stuff with me as much.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe not seeing that there was so much more to go, that you had a lot more
Yeah.
depths of exploration still to
Right.
go.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. They perhaps had a clinical treatment plan in their mind of help Katie either make this decision or be okay with where she's going, and a little bit of people pleasing probably going on with me being super positive about how things were
Of
going.
course. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Our bias at relational psych is being very depth oriented. And so that
Mhm.
was really interesting to me to hear. And I wonder in that moment, it might have been a while ago, but if you could recall, how could the therapist have stayed with you and gone deeper and given enough time?
Yeah. I think that they could have recognized and like even said out loud, "Oh, we're not finished here, are we? There's a lot
Mm,
more." And perhaps if they had noticed, I'm not the one to do this though, right? Perhaps if they had noticed that they actually couldn't go there with me, they'd say, I don't know that I'm the one to do this. I think we should refer you to somebody who's taken this path themselves. That would have
mm.
been a really interesting pivot, I think. Or,
That
yeah, go ahead.
Well, it just makes me think, like, how risky that can feel as a therapist to own
Yeah,
that, whether
yeah.
it's the honoring, maybe there is a desire to have that shared lived experience with the
Mhm,
client so that they could leave there, or another way I think about it is thinking that we can only take a client as far as we've got ourselves, so maybe
mhm,
it's not the shared lived experience, but it's that going into the depths and really sitting, staying in something for a really long time and knowing what that feels like inside of the
mhm.
therapist so that they can do that with the client as well.
Right? Because I think my process appeared very rational, very logical, very thought out. There were tears, of course, but I think that on the outside, me and a lot of other clients present like, this makes sense. This is sad and I'll be okay. But this makes sense for my life now. And I needed someone to break through that a little bit, I think.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
I've say yeah, I've just really kind of pushed in, but is there more, and
Right.
what is that?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I hear from other people that often therapists are interested in quickly shifting to another topic, that it is something that is kind of like, are we done with this now? Okay, well, that's big, but you've kind of decided. So let's move on. And in reality, when you talk to the community of both child free and childless, they will say, yes, it's kind of like this pivot point or this decision point or this kind of realization that you're on a different life path than you thought point. And that continues to affect you. It's never quote unquote done.
What are some things that affects you? I'm thinking of just age, maybe like your
Yeah.
age group, whether you've moved from early 20s to late 20s to now mid 30s, late 30s, like that could be a
Mhm.
thing, or 40s. What are other things that could shift or bring up a new way of processing it?
I think that meeting different people and relationships, perhaps going to a different work environment where there is a heavier focus on parenthood for some reason, or like something kind of comes up around that. I do find that people reaching midlife, even if it's a path that they have consciously chosen, are struck by, I guess the potential is really over now. Like this
Mm,
physical reality of it, I think can be sometimes relieving, right? There's something that happens about that can also be relieving, but also just this point to really feel like, oh, I haven't thought about this for years and it's coming up again,
mhm.
one way or the other.
Yeah, I think of that sometimes. I've heard someone who didn't get married. I think they're still unmarried in their 60s or 70s at this point, and one thing that they reflected on of not be this is a female saying, once she got into her 40s, she realized she wouldn't be a young wife or a young bride, and so even if, like, she didn't know what the future was, that distinction of, "I'm not gonna be this version of myself that I imagine,"
Mhm.
I can see that being for this issue as you get into the different life stages, like, it
Yeah.
recalibrates almost.
Right. Yeah. And I think a lot of people, when they realize, whatever age, like, oh, I'm not going to be a parent, am I? Or I don't want to be a parent, yay. And it will often fall to what's going to happen in my older age, because the way that our society is set up is people are expected to have family members taking care of them, and perhaps they're taking care of older or ill family members, no matter what age. And it can be this sense of vulnerability of, what if I'm sick and old? What if? How will I do that? And so I think that is something that comes up at various life stages when you're, I don't know, graduating college and the world feels very open to you. You might not be thinking of that quite yet, but as you're getting older, or your parents are experiencing illness or death, or your friends' parents are, you kind of start to think about that in a different way, about what will happen to me and what will it be like for me.
Yeah, and I can imagine that exploration can feel maybe scary because you thought you felt one way about it. And so
Mm.
having a new way of feeling about it, maybe there's a fear. Did I not think this through? Am I making the wrong decision?
Yeah.
Um, can you speak to that?
Yes, right. It can come up like, well, what is this alternate path going to end up like? Did I
Mhm.
not think this through? Because there aren't a whole lot of, it's hard to find like a quick webinar on what to do when you're perhaps single, childless, need nursing home care. Like what is that? Finding that information can be hard, but it is a time when I think people can be really more intentional. I think more intentional than people with kids are about what their later years might look like, really starting to plan. And I
Mhm.
don't know that people necessarily, like you said, are like, oh, I've made a bad decision. It's more like, I feel so vulnerable and
Mhm.
alone.
Mhm.
What do I do now? How do I figure this
Mhm.
out? And there are resources being developed and people working on this issue for sure.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Well, and I
Yeah.
think that that vulnerability is so interesting because the person without the children might have to confront the vulnerability, but it doesn't mean that the people with kids are any less vulnerable. I think there's a lot of assumptions that maybe are made in those structures, and so it
Yeah.
seems like these people that we're talking about that are thinking about it are maybe confronting the vulnerability in a very active way.
Yeah, yeah, and I do find a lot of people without kids have realized that what's perhaps important to them is they reach either an acceptance place, an adjustment place with being childless or intentionally child-free, always accepting that they are like, "What I want is this connection of family, a
Mhm.
connection of social connection, maybe chosen family." It's not necessarily being a parent to a child, and so feeling like, how can this connection of family be continued into older age, I think is where a
Mhm.
lot of people land with, oh, what now? Oh, wait, there are actually ways to financially plan and all that, but there's also a way to emotionally plan and socially kind of continue to build connections.
Mhm. Which brings me back to what you were saying about the pronatalism. I can hear messages in my mind now of, but wouldn't it just be better if you had a family when you're older? Do this so that you have kind of
Mhm.
access to a certain level of thriving. Obviously, that's more for the people who are choosing to be child free. But can you speak about that? The conversation around thriving or like the betterness that might come from any option?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think we forget the flip side of people talking about having a hard time with their relationship with their children and they're not thriving.
Uh-huh.
Right. So I think we see this rosy picture of family togetherness and the Hallmark movies or whatnot, for those of us, I guess, that watch them. And that's not reality, right? That's not reality for anybody. And that thriving in the best sense means thriving within community, to me at least, that it isn't just your own family that you are somehow related to where you thrive. And so in some ways, people without kids kind of burst that open and say, no, it's not about that. It's more about social connections and the bigger community.
Yeah, and that intentionality then to build it out, have agency on creating what that looks like for you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Agency and creativity. I think creativity and sort of this kind of relief and excitement about creating a different life than perhaps you had envisioned, or perhaps you see people around you
Mm,
doing or envisioning for you. Sort of that energy, I think, does come with work with clients in the therapy room. And I like to tell providers that it's not always kind of this walking through the what ifs and the
mm,
all the hard feelings that come up. That a lot of also what happens sometimes simultaneously is dipping your toe into the what could this be like though? Just
mm.
a real awakening of what do I as a person actually want? This could be okay.
Yeah, that just feels really open-ended, like, really rich to be able to think through all that.
Yeah, and if you define thrive, I think that might be it, right? Like where
Mhm,
you feel like you can really um, be who you are and what you want to be and be connected and have this very fulfilling, meaningful life. Because of course, life can be meaningful and fulfilling without children.
Yeah, how would you encourage someone who really wants kids,
Mhm.
who and is facing a life situation where that's likely not happening, whether it's infertility, a partner who doesn't want it, aging out of the opportunity, adoption, and
Mhm.
all of those kinds of things. Is there a way of framing that for themselves?
Yeah, I think that people feel like it's a one in, one out. If you, okay, I can't have kids, so I have to put something in my life that's just like kids and valued by society, just like kids. So I will have this new quote unquote baby of a thing. And that isn't necessarily where I think most people land healthfully. But I do think it's something that a lot of therapists err on and will say, oh, well, now you can do this, or you can really like, you can find meaning by volunteering with children. Or something, right? Like people hear that all the time.
Uh-huh.
Not helpful. But I think framing it as, okay, what do you really actually find meaningful in life? And lo and behold, you can find that in other things besides parenthood role. If we think of this, like Erickson's old model of development, and there's this idea of generativity, which I know has been studied a lot. And if you look at the scale or the items on the idea of generativity, which is like the for people who don't know, that is like the legacy and the meaning and the things you're generating in older midlife and older age, and that parenthood is just one. And I think there's at least 30, maybe
Mhm.
40 items on there. Like
Wow.
literally, parenthood is just one, but people think that's the only way to kind of have meaning. So I like to kind of
Yeah.
deconstruct what society thinks meaning is with clients and what clients actually think is meaningful about life.
Mhm. Yeah, it reminds me actually of some of my own story. I was in a season of life right before I started my group practice where some health issues happened, and it was very clear to me that I wasn't going to have kids anytime soon. And the conversation is very open ended, but I knew that I had all this energy for creating something beyond me, whether it was the kids question or just my energy. And it led me to building the group practice. That's part of one of my motivations for I wanted to build something beyond me. But I think that speaks to a little bit what you're saying of that generativity of there
Mhm.
wanting something beyond you, but it doesn't always have to be parenting or even having to deal with children, like, there can be so many other options.
Right. Yeah.
Mhm.
Anything that honestly lights your heart with joy and you
Mm,
feel like is beyond you and feels like doesn't have to be like this big purpose in life. It can just be a good, happy, quiet life and still have a lot of meaning.
mhm. When you think of other options of what is in that list of 30 things.
Oh, yeah. There were a lot of things that kind of felt like community groups, like
Yeah.
you are maybe involved in something related to civic activism. There were some like religious items, there was tutoring. So something that's kind of like sharing a skill, lending your wealth, literally lending wealth actually was another thing, like helping to financially support things, initiatives like that. So anything that kind of feels like, yeah, you keep saying like bigger than you. Yes, extended from you, bigger than you, but also leaves perhaps a part of you that you treasure and love. If you're a creative person, if you're an artistic person, if you love to bake, like whatever it is that's special about you that you're able to leave or give or share.
That's really cool. It's really cool to think of how much creativity can go into that with so many options.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that the thing that comes up that's hard in therapy is that people aren't in that mindset when they're grieving, when they're having a hard time, or if they're just experiencing a loss or having a hard time envisioning how this is possible. That's two very different brain spaces to
Yeah.
inhabit.
Yeah, and yeah, to try to push someone to thinking in that other way would be
Yeah.
so misattuned.
Right. And I think it's our urge because we don't want our clients to be sad and, oh my gosh, you can't have parents. It's going to be okay. I feel like that's perhaps the self dialogue during a session and whether or not a therapist hopefully doesn't just say that. But I think that's perhaps what comes up for us around this.
Mhm. Yeah, that can be a really hard balance. I think of that with anything, but I'm thinking of like depression of just don't be sad. Just stop it. How unhelpful that is and how impossible that is.
Right.
But how easy it might feel to lean into that with some of these other topics.
Right. Indeed. And expanding a worldview is part of our job and part of what therapy can do. But I think it is important to really follow the client's lead, especially when it's around parenthood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is kind of asking you on the spot, but what are some like bad things that a therapist can say? And I say bad kind of with jest, but what are the worst things that someone can say, whether a therapist or I guess anybody who has someone in their life who are thinking out loud about these things?
Yeah, I think that playing on this feeling of regret is something that's really hard and really harmful, that you're probably going to regret it if you don't at least try. Or won't you regret that? I think by the time somebody brings this up and finally says something about it to a loved one or a therapist, they've played through all kinds of things in their brain and they don't need to be told that they're going to regret something. So I think
Mhm.
that comes up. Yeah, a lot of the comments on the survey about what's gone wrong in therapy were really hard to read, real emotional to read because it was very harmful. And many of them haven't sought therapy again. They've been just like, I'm done. I don't want to go back. So, yeah, playing on regret, kind of saying, like, why didn't you, even if it's a well intentioned, like, oh, curious, like, why didn't you? Like, why does that even matter? Is that actually part of the client's treatment goal is to explore why they didn't do something? Or is that your
Wow.
curiosity?
Yeah, we wouldn't say that about a different career path or something. Why don't you think about being a teacher?
Yeah,
Not
I think like, you're really going to regret not being a teacher. Like, why would we say that to a client?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
On the flip side, anything come to mind of helpful things to say?
absolutely. People were really comforted and inspired by therapists that were seeing them as individuals and kind of really attuning and hearing maybe even self-disclosing. This is a topic that isn't talked about. I don't even know that I've talked about it with clients, or we didn't really learn about this in school. My gosh, you're really bringing this up. You must feel so alone. Really almost having a meta discussion with them about what it's like to be in therapy and to finally maybe find someone who's willing to um, not step on their toes or not push an agenda or reflect on what they bring to the session.
Yeah, I can just hear, even as you say that, how validating and normalizing it would be to hear that and say,
Mhm.
oh, what I'm bringing up is important. It matters. It's okay. I can say more.
Right. Yeah. And really believe the client's always the expert on their life is basic practice. And I think really investing in that one here and believing that it is perfectly okay if somebody changed their mind one way or the other way. Like that is normal. That is not pathologized. That's how it goes sometimes.
Mm. Is there any part to follow up on that? That someone, how do I ask this? If there is a lot of flipping flopping and it might matter to land if they can land on one end, do you have thoughts about that to either support someone or if you're experiencing that yourself?
Yeah. I think that it is more common than people know,
Hmm.
right? Sort of the back and forth. And maybe it's something that people don't bring up in therapy because they don't want to be seen as wishy washy
Yeah.
or, right? So I think really being happy that clients are sharing that extent of indecision, thinking about what are the larger things going on that are, causing you, influencing you to feel like, yes, you want kids, or no, you don't want kids, or now it's time to stop after all this infertility treatment, or like really helping people see, okay, what else is influencing you? And really normalizing the feeling of ambivalence is caring about two things very deeply and in a very kind of somewhat messed up way, like you're trying to be the most intentional parent you could be. And so it's this very maternal, paternal parent instinct
Mhm.
to try to pursue the right choice. And your brain is doing that by trying on different life paths.
I love that you said that because I think one thing that I've heard in the water about the conversation, there is this an assumption that if you self-select not have kids,
Mhm.
you don't care about kids or you don't care. There's
Yeah.
a flippancy about it, but I think that's such a beautiful way of thinking of how much care is going into the decision that it
Mhm.
really matters both for yourself, your own life, maybe your partnership, but then also these like hypothetical human beings that we're talking about. Systematic intention.
Right. Imagine if it was like that for all children, right? That there was so much intention built around their lives. I think we'd have a different world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Anything that we didn't touch on? Anything else coming to mind for you?
I think that a lot of people who don't have children trying to find a therapist that's going to get it, right? Like, how can I get it? And so I think that really being upfront, if you're seeking therapy, or maybe even if you're in therapy and you realize, oh, wait, I don't talk about this and I want to make sure my therapist gets it. I
Mm,
think that people should feel free to really ask us questions and to say, hey, this is what I've got going on. If they want to know if we have kids, I think that's an okay thing to ask. It's also okay for a therapist based on their model of practice to say, I don't discuss that part of myself. And then it's okay for that client to say, I need to know and I'm going to find somebody else. Right. So
um,
I think being really open about who's in the room, what you're bringing in the room, if people are, and within the realm of not having kids, of course, there's so many different of life paths and people. And like, I'm not the exact same as somebody who tried to have kids from their early 20s and experienced infertility their whole life. And like, that isn't me. And so I need to also make sure that I am learning about them,
mm,
interested in their view, seeing their lived experience for what it is. So I encourage clients to ask us questions, to try to get us on the same page. And if they're not feeling like educating to point, maybe you can find resources to find out more about this therapist or things like that.
yeah, that's a really good point that it's not the client's job to educate the clinician on that expert opinion. I think that,
Yeah.
of course, we need to be educated by our clients on their lived experience, but I think doing that labor of catching up your therapist, that's not your responsibility to do.
Yeah, for sure. So
Thinking about you and this being a primary type of work that you do, or you work with a lot of people of this, how has it changed the way you have an intake or you take someone in or you like ask questions? Is there a different approach that you've found over the years that helped you be more attuned to this experience?
I think so. Just all the way down to our paperwork, like what we ask on our what are the boxes that people check? Like being really looking through it and being like, okay, if I didn't have kids, how would I feel about this? This word family can be very emotionally laden. So maybe just loved ones or who lives in your home with you or
Mhm.
things like that. But yeah, assuming that that people without kids are coming to always talk about that can also be another thing that
Oh,
I think
yeah.
people, oh, you don't have kids. Of course, you have to explore this big grief, but perhaps it's just their lived identity that's going to be in the room. And so, in getting to know them and the kind of like this intake process, really helping to formulate, like, oh, okay, so you're not wanting to explore that. That feels done. It's in the room though. So, how can we make sure that we are acknowledging it as we're talking about other things? I want to make sure that anybody who's child free that comes to see me and they're exploring what it's like to be at work because they're having workplace communication, say, that
Mhm.
we're also paying attention to how their child-free status could be impacting that. And
Yeah.
so being really like overt with people, perhaps, okay, yeah, we don't have to explore that. I'm not here to like weed through that with you. You're feeling okay. And I want to acknowledge that it's always in the room with you.
Mhm. Yeah, I think in a really similar way that we might do to any other identity factors, like
Yeah.
being a female, maybe that's not, up for exploration about someone's
Right.
identity, and yet, yeah, how does that show up in the workplace?
Right. Yeah. And some things can come up. So just being open to if there's aspects of that you want to explore and this isn't your main goal right now, we can absolutely do that. I'm happy to do that in tandem or on their own.
Yeah, keeping that door open,
Mhm.
validating that it's something to explore.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. There's a lot of potential here. There's a lot of it's really rewarding to work with people and to see them realizing this different life path and that they can take steps towards it in a way that feels like unique and important to them. It's really meaningful.
Yeah, yeah, it sounds really rich. Again, that depth of meeting people where they're at and then just aligning them with their life vision, just like helping that become something that's really
Yeah.
thriving again.
Yeah, there really is.
Well, if anyone's listening to this and curious about resources, anything come to mind of how to continue this exploration?
Yes, tons of things actually. If people are on social media, there are lots of accounts and you can just put in some keywords, child free, childless, and see what pops up. In the child free world, there's the child free convention every year, which is like online videos that are
Mm,
all archived on YouTube. There's the World Childless Week, which is all archived and that happens in September. And then there's like the childless collective summits that happen here and there. And so there's a lot of these events of people coming together to talk, which you can, when I was in this ambivalent stage, I really poked my toe into, which is a
mhm.
lot of perhaps what therapists could do to help or people could do. Is okay, what could this actually be like though? What are their lives like? So those resources are great.
Yeah, as you said that, I've come across like a Reddit page on fence
Uh,
sitters. I think that's another
uh,
term I've heard before about kind of the ambivalence there.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, there are special little pockets that pop up with. There's a childless men's support group on Facebook that's lovely because there's not a whole lot of people talking about that. Like I feel like in the energy in this communities, I should say, many of them over the past 5, 10 years has just risen and risen, and it's kind of feels exponential. That there's a lot to find now. There are
Mhm.
books out there, so yeah.
Oh, that's so yeah, it's so encouraging to know that people don't have to be alone in this experience, whether the
Mhm.
exploration season of it or the
Yeah.
ongoing process of it, that there's a lot of communities to be a part of.
Yeah. Small yet mighty. And
Mhm.
it feels, I say social media and people think, oh gosh, like influencers and just like bad comments. But really, I have found it to be the most supportive place. And
Mhm.
people are really just there to hear each other's story and not one upping each other or not. It just feels very open. It's lovely.
Yeah, building real relationships, it sounds like too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You said small but mighty. I don't know if you have like percentages in your mind, but are we talking about 50% of the population?
Oh,
Are we
that's
talking
such a
about
good question.
everybody? Yeah, what is it?
That's a good question. So the research that looks at like how people reach midlife, like that's a termination point for that's what you mean, like the percentage that 1 in 5 people reach midlife without kids. And if you
Oh.
look at polls that are taken of people in their 20s and 30s, actually some of them go down to 19 and 16, which all the way up to midlife, there are a lot more people now saying that they're not going to have children. They don't believe they will than 1 in 5. Like it's a lot higher. So we'll see if that plays out towards midlife or not. So it is sizable. If you think about 1 in 5
Yeah.
people in your life for anything, that's kind of a large chunk of the people that you know.
Yeah, definitely. And midlife, are we talking 40s ish,
Yeah,
50s?
like 45 is
Okay.
usually when they look at women is where they say that we're done.
Okay, thanks.
I know. I know.
Yeah, opens up a conversation maybe for next time.
Sure does.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I
Yeah.
will have some resources in the show notes and your contact information. And I just really appreciate you opening up this conversation and helping us think about it in a both holistic way and a very affirming, encouraging, supportive way. It just feels like a really balanced conversation.
Yeah, I loved talking with you. I think your questions were so insightful and compassionate and really thoughtful. So I thank you for expanding the conversation where it went.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Relational Psych is a mental health group practice providing depth-oriented psychotherapy and psychological testing in person in Seattle and online in Washington State. If you're interested in mental health care for yourself or a family member, please reach out. Our website is relationalpsych.group.